Okay, in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to fit a connector to a cold water storage cistern. What you've got to be careful with these are you don't pick up the wrong nut, or the builder's merchant doesn't give you the wrong nut. As you can see, these two nuts, if you look closely, they've got two different threads. One's a fine thread and one's a standard 3/4 thread. So be very careful that you don't pick up the wrong nut when you're doing this. Right, the best thing to do is when you've got the nut, try it on the connector and make sure it screws right up, then you know you've got the right nut. It's so very easy to put the wrong one on, especially when it's on the tank. The wrong one, which I've got now, if you screw it on, you notice it go on 2 turns and it stop. And if you've got the olive on there, you think it's hit the olive, and then you wind it up with a spanner, and obviously it won't tighten up. We're using poly washers on this, 2 3/4 poly washers. One goes on the inside against the back plate, and the other one will go on the outside of the tank, so it's sandwiching the tank between the 2 poly washers. Okay, now how you hold it, you can either use water pump pliers or grips, and you tighten it up on the back nut on the outside. So I'm just showing you this without the tank in it because it's easier to see. Okay, now when you've got it tightened in, we pretend that's tightened on the tank. When you're doing the nut and olive up, like now, you still need the one spanner on the inside to hold against, because otherwise when you tighten the nut up on the nut and olive, like I'm doing now, it will unscrew through the connector and you'll have a leak. Now you can hold it also with a file, so if you've got a big tank and you're by yourself, you can jam a medium-sized flat file in there, and it will hold it really firmly. And then when you tighten up the nuts from the outside of the tank, the file will jam against the side of the tank, and you can tighten up without having 2 people. And afterwards you just have to flick the file out and it'll fall out. So that's one tip there. Obviously I'm using an expansion tank here because I don't want to use a cold water storage tank, but it's the same. It's just easier to show you with this small tank than it is a big cold water storage tank. Okay, so now we're going to fit it. So we put one poly washer on the inside, and I'm going to put a little bit of PTFE tape. Now this is just purely to lubricate the thread, and just to give it a little tiny seal on the thread. You see I'm only putting a little tiny bit on, you mustn't put too much on. The reason I'm putting a bit on is when you cut the hole in the tank with the hole cut, with thread, a circular hole saw or a cutter, it's very tight fit. You see I'm having trouble screwing that through, yeah, and that PTFE tape just helps it a bit, screw it through the plastic. Yeah, that's good, it's a nice tight fit. Don't even consider about heating up a knife and cutting the hole, or heating up a bit of pipe and pushing it through, because it will chemically change the area of plastic around the hole, and then after a while you'll start to have a leak after a couple of months or a year or so. So the other poly washer goes on the outside like you've just seen, and you put the back nut up. Yeah, then you need either to use the file, which you can do here, you jam it in between the 2 lugs and it'll hold it, or you use a pair of grips or water pump pliers. Okay, so adjust it to its smallest setting, grip it on the lugs. You can imagine if you've got a big tank, you're going to need 2 of you, or you need someone with very long arms, or you use the file, like I said, and let it jam it in, and it'll jam against the side of the tank. Okay, so you hold that, and then you tighten up the outside, so that's reasonably tight, and the 2 poly washers course are sealed. The PTFE tape's just purely there, not necessarily as a sealant, although it will seal it between the tank and the thread, if water does get past the first poly washer, which it won't. So it's just purely there to help lubricate it a bit. That's a good thing about PTFE tape. It's also good as a lubricant on threads. So now make sure you get your right nut. It's not that one, it's this one. I can tell them by sight, but if you're new, just wind it up again and check. Put your olive on, make sure your olive's on far enough that it's not standing on the end of the pipe, because you don't want to crush it on the end of the pipe, you'll have a leak. So it's got to be over the pipe. Push it into the connector, screw up your nut and olive. Get your spanner on the inside to hold against, because if you don't, you'll loosen up the tank connector again, what you just tightened up by tightening the nut and olive up. Yeah, it will actually turn, and then you'll have a leak again. Yeah, so that's important with both nuts, the back nut and the nut and olive, to hold against. Yeah, now use a spanner on these nuts if you can. It just doesn't mark it as much. Yeah, so it's good to have a nice big adjustable spanner. So grip it tightly on the inside and then you just tighten up. You don't need much. That's it, done. Okay, and never put PTFE tape on an olive. You don't need PTFE tapes on olives.